Some people present the Gilded Age as if it was just all bad and it was all terrible, and that's absolutely not correct. There were a lot of very positive things about the Gilded Age, and they really should not be ignored because they are enormous. First and foremost, productivity. The fact that we were able to now bring so much raw material to the cities, to the factories, and they could be produced much more inexpensively. Prices for everything fell. And so there is just a lot more of everything. And this is a really important fact to know. It wasn't until 1870, until the Second Industrial Revolution, when food abundance became the norm in the Western world. Obviously, even today it's not true everywhere, but since the 1870s, we have been able to produce an abundance of food. And that is different from all of human history. Throughout all of human history, there is a limited amount of resources, especially food, that everyone is fighting over. And the fact that food scarcity is, it's not that no one has a problem getting food now, but it is not like the rest of history. So the sheer amount of productivity meant there is more of everything, and not having to worry if you're going to starve to death. If you live in a rural area, that is a huge, huge deal, obviously. So it meant cheaper goods for everyone, which is better, obviously, universally better to have more, to have access to more things for less expensive. And so prices, like, for example, the price of a mattress, I think around 1965, it cost somewhere in the neighborhood of like $35 or $40, which that was a ton of money. But by the 1890s, you could get one for like $4 or $5. So that is the level of productivity, and the drop of prices is huge. And it leads to the second point, which is a higher standard of living. Everyone's life got a little bit more comfortable. Not everyone, but life got more comfortable for a lot of people, a lot of Americans, the majority of Americans. Because if you can buy a mattress rather than sleeping on hay, your life is so much better. But there's higher standard of living for everyone because things are cheaper. And this is really important to know, especially because of the railroads. Because of the railroads, all of a sudden, you could now order goods from the cities and they would deliver it. So the companies that will start this, Montgomery Ward and Sears, they combined to be Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward will eventually combine, but they would send out these huge, huge, huge mail order catalogs, and they were like 163 pages long, and they would have like tens of thousands of goods that now all of a sudden people could order from all over the nation. So this is like the early version of Amazon. And if you can imagine a world where you didn't have access to all this great manufactured goods, and all of a sudden now you could buy all of it and it's way cheaper. Life is just better for a lot of people. So standard of living was higher. And also now that the railroad is coming through your town, if you have a drought, you're not going to starve to death like people did throughout most of history. So everyone's life is just better. And obviously, well, not everyone's. There are a lot of people really, really struggling, but life, the standard of living is just better. And so that is an unmitigated plus for a lot of people. Also, without industrialization, the United States does not become the world economic superpower. And there are some problems that come with that, obviously. Like how unhappy we are as a nation. But this I can guarantee you, you would rather live in a world superpower than in a third world country. And living in the most powerful country is just a great thing. And it could not have happened without the Industrial Revolution and it being centered in the United States. So living in a world power is just a good thing. And of course, charity. The United States is the most charitable nation the world has ever seen. The United States gives more in charity than any other country. And the robber barons, the industrial statesmen, whatever you want to call them, they were incredibly giving with their money. Andrew Carnegie, after he retired at 65, he ended up giving away something like $350 million, and it went to all sorts of organizations, libraries, obviously, Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Hall, gave it to all sorts of things that are around to this day that we still benefit from. John D. Rockefeller gave away $500 million of his money. And I mean, to this day, we still benefit. Spelman College, it's a school in Atlanta for African-American women. He funded that. He also funded a little Baptist college, gave it $80 million, and it became the University of Chicago. Rockefeller Center, obviously, he gave tons of money. He created the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission that got rid of hookworm disease. So they're doing all sorts of great things with their money. Now, I will note, they treated the workers at their time really terribly, and we'll get to this. But so it's kind of interesting. They put their name, or they put their money into places that would, like, their name would be plastered on and they would be remembered for a long time. It's another way they're kind of like Jeff Bezos and like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg. I heard an interview with Jeff Bezos where a reporter asked him, "So why are you spending all this money to go into space?" And he said, "Well, what else would I do with it?" His exact words. And I don't know, maybe make it less terrible to work in an Amazon factory. The people that work in Amazon factories, they are absolutely essential, and that job is, if you haven't seen a documentary about it, it is a rough job. That's a similarity, is like they won't use their money to help people that are working for them at the time, but they'll use it for these huge grand things. But still, the United States being the most charitable country in human history, that's a very good thing. So there were a lot of positives of industrialization, and those should not be overlooked. But there, of course, were a lot of negatives too. One of them was ruin of the environment. So the Gilded Age is sometimes called the age of exploitation because these businesses exploited the environment, the land, the resources, even their clients and their competition. They exploited everything because they're out for profit and there's no rules to stop them. And so the pollution was absolutely terrible. And it was really bad living near cities. And if you look at China now, China is now going through that. China and India, because they're just becoming world superpowers. So they have a lot of pollution also because they don't have the regulations. And this is before we had an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, or an FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And for everyone that says, like, well, I think those are bad, that's because you didn't live in a time before them. That's hedonic adaptation. before that period, it was just awful. There's just all sorts of examples of it. One of my favorites is John D. Rockefeller. His first oil refinery was on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. And there was no laws against just dumping your oil into the water. So they just dumped oil into the water. And it was so bad that in 1969, so a while later, the Cuyahoga River had so much oil in it that it actually caught on fire. And it is impossible to set water on fire. That is how bad the pollution was in this river. That is someone dipping their hand in the water. So it was a lot of pollution all over the place, and it was just gross. So ruin of the environment, that was a problem. Another major problem was the sheer level of the extremes in wealth and poverty. Economic inequality, as you know from my introduction lecture, it is really bad for an economy because you need to have a lot of consumers. And economic inequality has a lot of problems, and at the time it was very extreme. So an average worker at like one of Rockefeller's factories, it was a husband, a wife, and 2 or 3 kids, and they made on average $490 a year, which today would be about $18,000, and that's working 60-hour weeks. You cannot live on $18,000 today with a family of 5. I mean, hell, you can't live on $18,000 a year with one person. So that is almost nothing, and that's the average manufacturer worker. John D. Rockefeller, in contrast, made about $1.8 billion a year. I mean, just an insane amount compared to how much the workers made. And should Rockefeller be paid significantly more? Yes. That much more, that is for, it's for everyone to decide. Economic inequality, though, was so extreme, and the problem is it was in your face. So if you live in a country where everyone's poor, that's not as bad as when you live in a place where the extremes are just so obvious. Like in the same cities, you have something like Andrew Carnegie's mansion, and then you had whole parts of the city that were absolute slums. You'd have shanty towns. In back alleys, people would just create these little towns to live in out of whatever garbage they could. And it was just so overcrowded and, gross and smelly. And then you had like Vanderbilt summer home. Every one of the rich tycoons that we've talked about, they had summer homes because if you lived in a city in the summer, the smell was so terrible, and people would have to just get out of the city. This is an immigrant woman. Her husband died. It's her and her baby, and she's living in the cellar of a business that is like a tiny, tiny little cramped area. And then you have Rockefeller's house outside the city, which obviously these are just monuments, incredibly gorgeous places. In the winter months, police stations would open up their jail cells so women wouldn't freeze to death. So they would have like 50 women crammed into prison holding areas just to stay warm. The extremes are a problem because when you live in this extreme and you are living in like Lyndhurst Castle, it was, the materials for this supposedly are so expensive that you could not build that today. But if you live in a place where you see these kind of extremes right in front of your face, these extremes in wealth and poverty, it is a problem because it also leads to radicalism. If you want to know what is a danger to a stable system, it is people that are so impoverished that they don't have any hope. And that's what people were experiencing in their day-to-day life. Best estimates, around 1900, the year 1900, the top 2% of Americans owned about 1/3 of all the wealth in the country, and the top 10% owned about 75%. So it's extreme. And side note, it's actually worse today than it was back then. Now, like, the top 1% owns the top third of the nation's wealth. It's part of the reason we are experiencing such political extremes right now, and the rise of fascism, socialism, communism in this country is because that level of economic inequality, it leads to radicalism. What will a parent do if their child might starve to death? Just about anything. So the extremes in wealth and poverty were dangerous. Also, the abuse of workers. And this is where the industrial statesmen, they were praised for how much money they gave away. But what was so bizarre is how doggedly they fought to make sure that their workers did not get any more benefits, didn't unionize, didn't get any help at all. So they donated huge amounts of money to these huge buildings, libraries, and stuff like that, but then they just brutalized their workers, and they really brutalized their workers. The problem was, fundamentally, there was too many workers. In 1860, there was about 3 million workers in manufacturing, and by 1900, there was about 13 million. So there was just a huge surplus of labor. That is the basic problem for workers. There's too many people that are looking for jobs, and there's a struggle for jobs. So outside of every factory door, there's a lot of people that want work. So if one person complains, throw them out and get someone else. There were so many workers that, and there's so many immigrants coming in, that cheap labor was the norm. And so that is where also immigration, it's good for the economy overall, but there are parts of the population that are hurt by it, and it's the people that work for low wages. So cheap labor is the norm, and also this is the beginning of the building of machines. And so now you have, instead of like someone that dedicated their life to, say, a cobbler making shoes, now you have machines that can do a lot of the work. So people that had been skilled labor, now they're being replaced by machines. And so a lot of people ended up in really menial jobs, and there's nothing they could do about it. They didn't have an education, and so they could be replaced at any moment by someone who was willing to work for them. And it was what you call a buyer's market, in that for the industrial giants, they had their pick of who they were of who they could hire. So workers were essentially at their mercy. During this period, the average work week for someone in manufacturing was around about 60 hours. They work 10-hour days, 6 days a week. If you worked in steel, which was insanely dangerous, they worked 72-hour weeks, so 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and then once a month, they'd either have morning shift or night shift, and once a month they would switch. So once a month they would have to work a 24-hour shift in a steel mill, and that is insanely dangerous. And they're being paid, again, the equivalent of about $18,000 a year today, which is just nothing. There was absolutely no job security. If you worked on a job, there is no guarantee that you will have that job whatsoever. Well into the 20th century, it was normal to fire women because they got pregnant. And this is really important to know. The United States at the time was the only industrialized nation that did not have some form of workers' compensation. Workers' compensation, someone is injured or killed on the job, they or their family are economically compensated, or they get some sort of financial support. But that did not exist in the United States. And again, it's the only industrialized nation that did not have it. There's no federal regulations for safety or enforcement. If you were hurt on the job, you could sue your company. But the political system, which includes the courts, includes the judges, they were sympathetic to business. So you would have to prove that there had been negligence on the company's part, which was almost impossible, especially because the judges, people looking over the case, they were not sympathetic. In the United States throughout the 1890s, on average, there was about 25,000 to 30,000 deaths per year on the job. And there was about 1 million serious injuries. If you had a job that's considered called a roughneck job, and that is a job, any job that is considered very dangerous, which one of the big ones was railroads. Railroads were incredibly dangerous work. But there was a lot of factory jobs that were considered roughneck, like steel. 2/5. So 40% of people in those jobs would either die or have serious injury. And if you worked at one of these jobs, like pork factory, and you had a serious injury and you lost an arm or you lost in one of these machines, you just get fired because you can't do the job anymore. And there's a bunch of people that want to take your job, so you get fired and you get nothing. You go home, you tell your wife, I have no job, and who's going to hire you now? And so it was, unsurprisingly, because the United States had no workers' compensation laws, no regulations. The United States also had per capita the most amount of accidents and deaths of any industrialized nation. And at the time also, there were no child labor laws. This is something that is, people debate this, like, oh no, I think it's great when kids can work. Yeah, that's because we've lived in a world without child labor. Actually, a lot of states in 2023 and 2024 are getting rid of their child labor laws, and the world without child labor laws was horrifying. And we know this because of a guy named Lewis Hine. He went out and actually went throughout the country and actually interviewed and looked at what it was like in the situation. This kid right here, he's St. Louis, Missouri. He's a newsie, sells newspaper. He's 5 years old. He is 3 foot 5 inches tall, and he works 8-hour days. That's a 5-year-old. This kid right here is a 7-year-old. One of the worst jobs was working in coal mine. Kids had small hands, so they could sift through the rock. That's what they're doing. They're sifting through the rock and picking out the coal, picking out the rock. And they're working like 8 to 10 hour days. They don't have any masks too, so they're breathing in all that stuff. That's why the picture's so fuzzy. That kid in the back, he used to be one of them, but then he graduated and he reached a stage, and now his job is he stands there with a stick, and when the kids start falling asleep, because you know how 7 and 8-year-olds are when they've been working 6 hours, they get tired for some reason. And so his job is to give them a whack on the back to get them to wake up. Coal mining especially was an really, really, really rough job that relied on child labor. It's one of my favorite pictures because of that kid that's on the far side that's smiling. Like, just looks happy as anything. I worked at Discount Tire for 3 years, and I worked with a kid like that. In the winter months when, you go in and it's freezing, literally freezing in the tires, and Discount Tire, of course, is open because always open whenever, they're always open. And everyone's freezing and comes in like, hey guys, aren't you happy to be here? I'm just happy to be with my friends. And everyone hated that kid so much. That's that kid. Cigar makers in Florida, the oldest is 14, one of them's 12, one of them's 10, and they're working 10-hour days, rolling cigars, and of course they all smoke, because what else are you going to do for that long? Oyster shuckers in Louisiana, they go and shuck oysters, and they start their day at 3:50 in the morning and they work till 5 p.m. And that is also, those knives are insanely sharp, and so people would cut their fingers off. That child in the picture is looking at the camera. She's 3 years old. She's too young to work, but there's no child care, so she just goes with her mom and is there from 3:50 in the morning till 5 in the evening. This is family that works at a cotton mill. This woman had 11 kids, and her husband died. The oldest two got married, so it is a mother and her 9 kids. The youngest one is 2 years old, and the oldest one I think is 15. And they work 10-hour shifts, and the mother makes $4.50 a week, and all 9 kids work, except 2-year-olds, of course, but all the kids together make another $4.50 a week. So together they're making $9 a week. Like, what chance do they have? So it's when there were no child labor laws, it was really ugly. And I've heard people say, like, well, I worked at my parents' business. That's different. That's working for your family. That is not the same as working at a coal mine. So in general, for the majority of the population, working life was absolutely terrible. So the abuse of workers was a huge problem during the Gilded Age. So was government corruption. And this is probably the most corrupt period. Well, it is almost definitely the most corrupt period in U.S. history. Corruption was the norm. And again, there's no laws against a lot of the stuff that was happening, but businesses would very freely and openly bribe public officials. And so they would control politics and get the politicians to pass laws to help them. And it was basically whoever had the most money could do whatever they wanted. The really, really rich essentially owned the government. Large corporations, they had more power than the government at this time because the government did what they wanted. And that was especially true. It was true at all levels, local, state, and national. But obviously at the national level, it was just so in your face. And this is really important for you to know. This was especially true of railroads. Railroads, they had corruption at all levels of government. And they are the ones that especially started with the most political corruptions, and they are the ones that will have the most notable examples of government corruption. And there's just all sorts of them, but they are the ones that led. They are the industry, of all the industries, they are the ones that got the most out of all levels of government. And they received the most money of any industry. And for reasons I mentioned before, they were necessary, and so all levels of government gave them tons of cash, but the people that were giving them the cash would usually work for them, but the railroads especially had the biggest amount of corruption. And finally, monopoly power. During this period, there was a consolidation in a lot of industries. A lot of industries sought to consolidate their power to prevent the corruption, or I'm sorry, to prevent the competition, because competition was seen as wasteful. So all the companies started consolidating, and they sought to control each other. By 1900, there were a tiny amount of companies that owned or controlled more than 35% of the entire U.S. economy. Like I said, John D. Rockefeller, he controlled 90 to 95% of all oil manufacturing in the United States. And these monopolies would dominate entire markets. And just so you know, monopolies are bad, because when they get too much power, then they can just abuse workers. And not just that, they abuse their own customers. And there's nothing the customers can do about it. They price fix, and there's all sorts of ways monopolies abuse their power, but there are no laws against this at the time. So this is the first we had seen this kind of concentrated power in industries. And the industry that was most responsible, of course, was the railroads. Not most responsible, I should say the most egregious offenses were by the railroads, because railroads had a natural monopoly. They will determine whether entire towns succeed or fail. And once they have a line going through a city, they control all commerce going into and out of that city. So they had natural geographic monopolies, and they would abuse the living hell out of their power in all sorts of ways. And we'll talk about some later, especially when it came to agriculture. But if you're a farmer, you know, and you were selling your products, the railroads would watch the market. And so let's say you're selling cotton, and the price of cotton goes up, which means you as a farmer are going to make more money. So then what the railroad company would do is they would raise their prices the same amount, and so they would take any profit. So especially for farmers, it was just a disaster, and we'll come back to this next week. Railroad monopolies were especially problematic. The only reason John D. Rockefeller was able to gain as much control of the oil industry as he had was because of his control of the railroads. The railroads are what gave him that monopoly in the oil industry even. So railroads were essentially at the heart of it. So overall, there are a lot of benefits from the Gilded Age, and there are a lot of problems. I think it's safe to say that during the Gilded Age, in a macro sense, it is good for the majority of the population. We should all be happy that this happened, but it was an insanely difficult time to live in for a majority of the population. And it is the majority of the population. The majority of the population is just really struggling economically and has no protections whatsoever. So good in the macro sense, but you do not want to live through this period. I had a colleague in graduate school who used to say that, no, it was fine to live back then. And he insisted that if he had lived back then, he would have been fine because he would have been one of the rich people. It boggles my mind because in 21st century, he's a historian who, we're not the rich people, just so you know. And for some reason he thinks, like, in current days he is definitely not, but back then he would have been, whatever. Anyway, it was a difficult time to live. You don't want to live through the Gilded Age, but we should all be happy that it happened.